narcissism, autism, and Asperger's syndrome. All four of these things, he says, has an indication of a lack of empathy. So then he goes on and says, evil and cruelty are the result of lack of empathy. Now, if you're a philosopher, the first thing you're going to do is put a big circle around that statement. So keep it in your mind, because it's something that I think we have to deconstruct when we come to the end of this. He argues that it is not the result of a theological category of sin. Obviously, what he's trying to suggest is that the Judeo-Christian notion that sin brought evil is somehow or other not where he's going to make his analysis. Thirdly, he says it's not the result of an incarnate evil that is a devil, i.e., there is no kind of embodiment of evil anywhere. Then it is not purely the result of social disorder or the environment. So you can't argue that it is socially constructed or culturally constructed in its absolute sense, because it seems to be much more than that. It's not purely the result of a physical condition either. So it is not genetic, and it's not based upon any kind of analysis of the mental structure of your mind. And finally, he argues that empathy reflects a variety of categories and associations, and it is those categories of association that he thinks can reveal to us a way of comprehending empathy or lack thereof as the basis for his so-called science of evil. Now, briefly, I'm going to take you through all of this. I'm not going to walk you through all of these areas of the brain that are operative in empathy. If you really want to read all that, then I would suggest you go to the book. But he argues that all of these areas of the brain, all of these regions of the brain are involved in what we would call empathy. And as a consequence, he uses the term the empathy circuit, implying thereby that there is a circuit within the brain that handles empathy, or that is involved in empathy. And I want you to, in your philosophical sense now, to put a red, put some kind of a red circle around this too, because the empathy circle here, according to him, is singular. And I think there are problems with that. So all of these areas, he says, has something to do with it. And very briefly, emotional recognition, pain matrix, intentions and beliefs, judging someone's direction of looking, all of these issues, he says, have connection to this empathy circuit. The coding sensory experience, the mirror response of recording things and then working on these things in your own feeling, like somebody pinches somebody else and you say, ow, that kind of thing, he says, is part of this circuit. And finally, the amygdala, where the emotional learning and regulation takes place. So all of these things, he says, are involved in this. Then he makes an analysis based on this of several types that he's had to deal with in his psychological career. Okay, and so he's going to establish, I guess what you would call it is areas in which he has experienced or he has found zero, negative, up to positive kinds of empathy reactions. So he has a type B, which is a borderline, and he says Marilyn Monroe has exhibited this kind of borderline zero negative In other words, there was an extreme, she was extreme in saying destructive things for others, i.e., when I said to Mother, I want to kill that guy, that's a type B disorder. In effect, what I would be doing then is expressing an extreme kind of destructive things. Well, apparently Marilyn did this all the time, especially when she got into the alcohol or the drugs. Secondly, he talks about the psychopath type. This is a total detachment from others' feelings. Cold, calculating, completely selfish. Okay, so in effect, if at Billy's death I had said, good riddance, or if I said, great, who cares? Or even worse, if I had just been absolutely cold about it, if I had said nothing about it, that would have put me in the type P area. Then he talks about the narcissistic type, type N, total entitlement of self, the use of others, discarding those who are useless, i.e., someone sees a beautiful girl and he gushes all over the place, and he's trying to attract her attention, and he does all kinds of things to attract her attention and gives her expensive gifts. And finally she says, are you hitting on me? I've already got a boyfriend. And immediately he says, well, you're a rat. I don't have anything more to do with you. All of the stuff I've done for you, and this is the way you treat me. In effect, then, a completely self-oriented reaction. Now, Asperger's syndrome is a very interesting kind of thing, because it is many people who have this kind of thing have an avoidance of all kinds of social interaction. They reject any kind of involvement with others, and they are obviously very lonely, and sometimes they pattern what is called obsession. They are obsessed with being alone, and they go to all kinds of degrees to be it. And then finally, the area which Simon has done most of his work in is in autism. So if those of you who have someone with autism, it might be worth you reading this book just for the work that he's done in that area, because he has done some very interesting stuff in looking at autism. And frankly, it is because of autism that he writes this book. In other words, he has developed what he calls the science of evil, not because he is convinced about the empathy-evil connection. Frankly, I think he has written this book because he sees this as a type in his autism work, and so therefore he has done a great deal of work in this area. But he calls this seropositive. Now, why would he call this seropositive? Well, he calls it seropositive because it's not hurting anybody but yourself, right? If you're antisocial and you just lock yourself up in your room and you stay there, well, okay, that's not hurting anybody else. And then from the perspective of autism, there's underactivity and empathy. There's just no engagement whatsoever, and as long as it's personally directed and there's no real problem with it, why, then it's not particularly socially difficult. So he calls this seropositive. Then the next chapter, he looks at genetic evidence, and this is, I think, rather interesting, because he argues that there is a gene, an aggressiveness gene, the MAOA-H, which is the warrior gene, and the warrior gene, you might know, has been identified in the Maori people in New Zealand, because the Maoris have a long tradition of the warrior as the key individual within the community. And so they actually stylize boys to being warriors. Some of this has relationship too to the Plains people in the United States and Canada, where they train boys to be nothing but warriors. Well, the fact of the matter is that they have done tests on the Maori people, and in fact, this gene, in which the individual is totally aggressive, is found much more dominant in the Maori people than in others. And so it's a very interesting phenomenon. Secondly, he talks about emotional recognition, and he identifies these particular areas as areas where you can argue that there are genetic impedance to empathy. So these two genes are known to hinder what we would call fellow feeling, or awareness of where other people are, or even what we would call otherness, i.e. to be sympathetic to others. And of course, the AVPR1A, for many of you who know about autism, is often linked with fear and anger, and the autistic person is often seen as genetically tuned that way. Then he argues that there are several genes in his study that point out that there is an empathetic gene, i.e. that we are predisposed genetically towards empathy. So that my reaction to Billy Fluter means that I'm quite normal, that the circuits in me and in my brain operate the way in which most people do. So therefore, there are empathetic genes that are built into the system. Well, I've done a once-over quickly. Here are some questions that I have about the book. And he, at some points, raises some of these issues. So perhaps I'll just throw them out and you can think about them and we can discuss them. Is it possible to develop empathy? If you were genetically predisposed towards lack of empathy, or negative, zero negative, is it possible to develop it? If that's the case, then you should be able to socialize people into being empathetic. And this is an issue that he, in fact, raises and he discusses at some length. If you have none, are you necessarily bad? So, in effect, if you have no genetic traits this way, and if your empathy circuit is somehow or other broken down, does that necessarily make you bad? Now, there are implications when you raise that issue about the whole notion of the science of evil. Because if you're not necessarily bad, then what connection to that does that have to the whole narrative about evil in culture? It's a huge question that he doesn't examine in this book. So the next issue that we should perhaps think about is, remember Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan, when we had the Cold War, what did he say about Russia? What did he call Russia? Anybody remember? The evil empire. Now, what amazes me is now that the evil empire is no longer evil. You know, and when you go there, there's not much evil anywhere. It's just, you know, like any other country, it's got its problems. So by declaring Russia or the Soviet Union to be the evil empire, he kind of painted Russia into a corner. Well, can a state then be empathetic? I mean, if we're going to use this kind of language about one state, can we use empathetic language about another state? And here I think we see that the whole thing begins to fall apart. At least to me it does. It's really problematic. from my perspective, to stretch the notion of empathy into something like empathetic. I'm willing to accept the fact that maybe